You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 12th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
And to Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles.
What a thrill. Los Angeles, you're next up.
As the Olympic Games wraps up in Paris, France is forced to face the political crisis that's been brewing in the background. We'll get the latest on the French reality check. Could one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world be drawing to a close? Stakeholders are optimistic that peace talks about Sudan in Geneva this week may bring the conflict to an end. After winning over 99% of the vote in Rwanda's election, Paul Kagame had plenty to celebrate at his inauguration yesterday. But do his people feel the same as he begins a fourth term in office? Fiji's leader is in China for the next 10 days. That's enough to send chills down the collective spines of Western leaders as they wrestle for dominance in the Asia-Pacific. We'll find out more. We'll have a roundup of news from the Balkans and a quick check of the world's front pages. Plus...
we are surviving not only the political and technical reorganizational changes, we also are surviving struggle for peace and for our lives and for preservation of the cultural heritage.
We'll hear from Ukraine's Deputy Culture Minister. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had launched an incursion into Russian territory to restore justice and pressure Moscow's forces in his first acknowledgement of Kyiv's surprise offensive into the western Kursk region. Israel expanded evacuation orders in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip overnight, forcing tens of thousands of Palestinian residents and displaced families to leave in the dark as explosions from tank shelling reverberated around them. And Hong Kong's top court today unanimously dismissed the bid to overturn the convictions of media tycoon Jimmy Lai and 6 other pro-democracy campaigners for an unauthorised assembly in 2019. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Emmanuel Macron should be able to breathe a sigh of relief. The Olympic Games have come to a successful close, but the Paralympics are still to come and the political paralysis continues. Our team's been in Paris for the past couple of weeks. Tom Webb watched the closing ceremony last night and sent us his thoughts.
The big surprise of the night coming from the incredible acrobatic performances. And I'm not referring to Tom Cruise rappelling off the stadium roof here. We all saw that one coming. Perhaps we were sort of expecting the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Snoop Dogg and Billie Eilish in France. Instead, they were at a windy Venice beach, which played host on the big screens within the stadium. The fans who were present, they were treated to live performances from Air, Angèle and DJ Kavinsky, amongst many others, which just created this lively, energetic and dynamic display to end what was a truly terrific Games. And they swapped out the almost comedic level of rain from the opening ceremony for an unusually baking evening set to turn 38 degrees today. The flame may be extinguished, but Paris put on such a show. The city was on fire once more.
Well, today the party's over, and as the smoke clears, the political parties go back to bickering over who'll be Prime Minister. I'm joined now by Philippe Mallière, who is Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. Philippe, many thanks for coming back on the show. Now, France has been able to put politics aside for a couple of weeks, but now, what are the realities that Macron needs to face?
Good morning, Georgina. As you said earlier, France now faces a reality check, clearly, because Emmanuel Macron decided on a political truce a couple of weeks ago, just when the games were about to start. It was very convenient because, yes, France has no government, following the snap election of a month ago. France still doesn't have a government. The people in charge of the games, in fact, were the incumbent government, which lost the election a month ago. So Macron now needs then very quickly to form a government, or at least he needs to respond to his opponents. To start with, the left, which came on top of the election, has put forward a name, Lucie Castex. That's the name of the female politician who would be the wannabe prime minister. And he's got a reply. I mean, that name was put forward to him before the game. So imagine everything was put on hold for about a month. So the whole situation is quite surreal because during the games, of course, as you said, France enjoyed the games, was passionate about it. There was happiness in the end. The French stopped bickering and even moaning for that duration. So that was quite unusual. But now, of course, political reality is back. And Macron has a big task on his hands.
And so which names are in the frame? Because it's not only Castex.
There are several names. Another name, Lucie Castex, is a name put forward by the left. Now, there are other names being floated, such as Xavier Bertrand, who is the leader of Les Républicains, the main conservative party. So that would probably mean that if that name was finally picked by Macron, that there would be a coalition government between his own party and Les Républicains, so a kind of centre-right, right-wing coalition. In any case, one needs a coalition, and that's probably the weakness of the left. The left, so far, although the main party in parliament would like to go it alone, but of course figures don't add up. You need they're about 100 seats short of a majority. So how can you govern if you're 100 seats short of a majority? It will be very hard. And whatever we all looked at the different combinations, and there is no safe combination, no combination which would easily reach the majority. So expect a kind of minority government, expect a coalition government probably, but it's very early to say what kind of coalition government we will get.
And what will the left do? Will they take action if they don't get their woman in the job?
Well, I think they will push very hard for, to be given a run in government. And I suppose in a way Macron could try that. He could say, well, okay, you came first, so I'll give it a go and try to form a government. And probably the left will realize that without a coalition, i.e. without the support of further forces from the center or centre-right, they can't govern, because every time they will put a bill in parliament, it will be censored. So he could try that, and I would sort of prove to the left that they can't govern on their own. Will he do that? I'm not sure, because I think the talks within the sort of political circles where that Macron were thinking about a coalition without the left, or at least would try to get on board some people of the left, the more moderate part of the left. But again, that's very hard. And for 2 weeks, there was no politics in France whatsoever. So that's again a very, very strange situation. No government for about a month, never happened in France. And for 2 weeks, it was like, France was a sort of beacon of happiness. Everyone was talking about the games, and politics seem not to exist anymore.
And I mean, it was a great soft power win for France. And I wonder if Macron had not called the snap election when he did, if he had done it after the Olympics, might there have been a very different result in this kind of loved up atmosphere?
That's a very good point that you're making, Georgina. And I thought about it. Other people thought about it too. With retrospect, you may argue, yes, it was a very bad move on the part of Macron to call a snap election right after, on the night of a crushing defeat. It was the European election. This is when he decided to call that snap election. You don't call a snap election when you just lost heavily an election. That's what he did. And had he waited and done that now, he could. There was no obligation for him to dissolve a month ago. Yes, he would probably be in a stronger position because there would be a kind of feel-good factor could be certainly playing in his favour, and probably the result will be better for his party.
Philippe, it's not just domestic problems. France has issues with its overseas territory, New Caledonia. What's going on there?
Well, I think, yes, there's still a crisis going on. It started a while ago. And yes, there's a lot of a lot of healing to do, a lot of work to do to restore, first of all, peace, to restore, a trust between the different parties. And it's an island which but for the time being, is not doing okay. There's a lot of tensions. There's a lot of fights even. And big economic crisis as a result of that, or a deepening of it. So that's another big thing that Macron will have to tackle. And there are so many things, because those past 2 weeks coincided with the games, which Macron largely attended, but also with his own holiday. And Macron takes always a 2-week holiday each year. He goes to the south of France. And that was interrupted this year because he wanted, of course, to greet French athletes, notably those winning gold medal. And that's what he did. So now back to work, I would say.
Philippe, thank you very much indeed. That's Philippe Mallier there. And this is The Globalist. It's 8:11 in Khartoum, 7:11 here in London. 10 million people have been displaced by the conflict in Sudan. 25 million don't have enough to eat, and there are catastrophic abuses of human rights ongoing. But there are hopes that peace talks that begin on Wednesday in Geneva may bring an agreement between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. Well, I'm joined now by Leila Mulana Allen, who's Monocle's Middle East correspondent. And Leila, I understand you've recently returned from Sudan. I wondered if you could start by giving us a broad overview of the current situation on the ground there.
I have. There are two reasons why we're not getting much news out of Sudan. The first one is, unfortunately, that there just isn't enough focus on this horrific humanitarian disaster that's been going on since the war broke out in April last year. And the second is that it's very difficult for journalists to get access. It's very tightly controlled. I did manage to get in. I spent 2 weeks traveling around the Sudanese armed forces held part of the country. And the displacement crisis is horrifying. It touches everywhere you go. Families are travelling hundreds of miles on their own, on a donkey cart or on foot. What's happening is that every time they're displaced, they go and live in a displacement camp or a disused flat in a town nearby. And then the RSF turns up and they have to flee again. And the RSF fighting style is really a marauding style. They are a guerrilla militia. They turn up on the back of Toyota pickups with weapons and flood towns and villages. The kinds of stories we're hearing from people: horrifying rapes, looting of every building, killing everyone they see. So there are people now who've been displaced 5-6 times. They've lost family members on the way. They've lost children. They have very little to eat. Towns are simply overwhelmed. Everyone is trying to do what they can. It's quite incredible to see what the Sudanese people are doing for each other. They are the main source of help and aid. The government's not doing much. The international agencies aren't doing much, partly because they can't get to people and partly because their aid campaign for Sudan really hasn't been funded much. So we've essentially got locals who are fearing for their lives, taking what they can out of their cupboards to help other locals who have fled. And these hundreds of thousands of people spread across the country in horrific conditions.
So the main parties are the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, but there seem to be many others involved. Who else has troops there?
So firstly, within the country, one of the distinct things about Sudan is that there are hundreds of militias across the country, many of which have existed for decades, because, of course, until just over a decade ago, South Sudan was part of Sudan. So there were militias that were fighting for the secession of South Sudan. There were militias that were fighting against certain groups inside Sudan. Now, some of those have come together. There was an agreement, the Juba Agreement, that essentially made peace between certain different militias. Some of the militias came together under the Sudanese armed forces. Others came together under the RSF, which traditionally was a militia, then was brought into fight under the Sudanese armed forces and then broke away again last year. Then there are also foreign actors. Now, it's very clear that the United Arab Emirates have a strong interest in Sudan, much as they did in Yemen, where I reported for many years as well. They want Red Sea ports. That's very important to them. Sudan also has gold mines. It has cobalt mines. It has a lot of oil. So the UAE is very interested in getting involved with all of those things. And what they appear to be doing essentially is funding the RSF and sending them weapons across the Chadian border, smuggling those in to help them. We've also seen Russian involvement, evidence of that. Wagner Group mercenaries, who are, of course, very close to Vladimir Putin, have been seen operating on the RSF side. But then Russia has also been cooperating with the Sudanese armed forces and seems to be now supplying them some weapons as well. We also found evidence of weapons from Serbia, weapons from Turkey. And then also on the Sudanese armed forces side, it looks like they've now reformed relations with Iran, which were pretty rocky. And although it hasn't been confirmed and they're being quite quiet about it, there seems to have been an arms deal signed with Iran as well. And then, of course, we've got foreign actors trying to get involved on the diplomacy side as well, chiefly Saudi Arabia and the United States. So it's a very complex and moving situation.
So there have been many attempts at peace talks. They've all failed. Is there a reason for optimism this time?
Absolutely not, unfortunately. The tone of these peace talks were announced a couple of days after I arrived in Sudan, and the tone across the country with almost everyone was ranging from despondent to deeply cynical. The talks thus far that have taken place have mostly been in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. And there was an agreement last year on a humanitarian framework. One of the main issues right now is the fact that both the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces are not creating clear pathways for aid to access people. That's why we've already seen famine hit in one part of North Darfur, and there's over a dozen places that are immediately at risk of famine. We're looking at potentially millions of people starving by September. This agreement was made in Jeddah last year. None of it has been observed. So many people saying, if we can't even implement those things that were agreed to, why would anything more happen now? And the United States is being very tentative in what it even wants to achieve in these talks. They are simply saying, we're not even going to try and negotiate between the SAF and the RSF right now, the SAF being the Sudanese armed forces. We are simply trying to hammer out those humanitarian frameworks so that people can get aid, so that people are allowed to freely pass, so that civilians are not being shelled in their homes, hospitals aren't being attacked. Every hospital I visited has been shelled and hit by small arms fire at least once in this conflict. The second issue is that the Sudanese armed forces haven't even agreed to attend yet. They've given various reasons why not. One, of course, as I say, is that the old agreement hasn't even been followed, so why would a new one be? Secondly, because the United States has prevaricated a little bit as to whether they really do accept the Sudanese armed forces as the leaders of the country and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan as the president, because, of course, they took power in a military coup in 2021 over what was supposed to be a democratically held election. And the third issue is that the United States really is not respected as an actor in this situation. Thus far, Tom Perriello, the new Sudan envoy, hasn't even entered the country. There's been a big brouhaha because twice he is asked to come into the country, the second time accompanied by Samantha Power, the head of USAID, who's the biggest US arm for aid in countries that need it. And both times they have said that they refuse to come any further into the country than Port Sudan Airport. Now, Port Sudan Airport is a tiny little airport in what's being used as the military capital because Khartoum has been taken by the RSF. It's comical when you've been there to think that peace talks could be had there. But more importantly, the Sudanese armed forces and the government feel deeply disrespected. And they feel that if American representatives are too afraid or too cynical to even enter the country and come to the president's presidential palace and have proper discussions with them, why on earth would they engage with these actors? And some people have told me that they think it's just about the US election. So all round, there's really very little hope that these talks will do much more than make the US look like it's interested in this conflict.
I mean, Leila, even in the unlikely event that the two main groups within Sudan agreed to peace, would the other interested parties allow this to happen, given their vested interest in extraction there? You know, as you say, vast
difficult to know. It's difficult to know what would happen in that scenario. The first issue is that it's almost impossible to see how the Sudanese armed forces would negotiate with the RSF and where the grounds for any kind of rapprochement would be. The reality is that we are talking about a militia that is very well trained, that was given the opportunity to fight within the Sudanese armed forces, that did so and then broke away essentially because its leader, known generally as Hemedti, wants power for himself, it would seem. Now, these people, some of them are Sudanese, but many of them are foreign mercenaries who've been brought in, are essentially going round, as I said, raping women, killing civilians, looting villages. Now, the Sudanese armed forces are accused of war crimes themselves in their fighting, but not at the level that the RSF are. So the idea that the Sudanese people would accept this group being brought back under the umbrella of the government is a pretty far stretch. And in terms of the foreign powers, the UAE is very pragmatic. We saw this, as I say, in Yemen, which is the most recently comparable conflict, where interestingly, actually, the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces fought as foot soldiers for the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So they have experience of this kind of resources-driven conflict. The UAE probably would be willing to take a step back. They, of course, don't even admit they're involved if deals were signed to give them some of what they want economically, because they really just have economic interests here. Russia, it's harder to tell, but they seem to be playing both sides. So as long as they felt they would have a say in the future, that would probably be all right. Iran, as I say, has won the goal of having its diplomatic relations restored with Sudan. So it's really just about weapons sales for them here. And the other interests do seem to be largely about weapons sales. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia hasn't really got involved militarily, and they do seem to be pushing quite hard for having a role as a key negotiator and a mediator in this sort of new cleaned up image that they've been trying to promote over the last few years in terms of human rights, which of course bears no relation to the human rights record inside the country. So it's not necessarily a case that the foreign actors wouldn't allow it. It's more that this is a deeply chaotic and unstable situation, and many countries seem to be taking advantage of that.
Layla, thank you very much indeed. That's Layla Malala Allen. Still to come on the programme, what's next for Rwanda as Paul Kagame is sworn in as president yet again? This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Latika Burke, who's a journalist and expert on geopolitics and also always very glamorous.
That's not true. That's not true.
Let's start with Marcos. He's warned Beijing after an aircraft clash over the South China Sea. This is a story from the Times. What's the detail on that?
Yeah, this is really interesting, Georgina, and good morning. Happy hottest day of the year so far to you. This is a very interesting statement from President Marcos of the Philippines. And for many, many months now, and as Monocle listeners would be well aware, we've been documenting how China has been harassing Filipino military, attempting to re-equip what is a contested rusting ship on the Scarborough Shoal. And in recent weeks, the Chinese and the Philippines government agreed to a de-escalation pact, if you will, because it was becoming very, very serious, and there were serious concerns about this and these skirmishes and encounters tipping over into something quite serious. So they both agreed to a de-escalation pact. This was pretty widely welcomed throughout the region, if, of course, it held, and that was always the question, was China really genuine about this? Well, now, over the weekend, we see some indications that perhaps not. Surprise, surprise. We had an incident where Chinese planes dropped flares in front of a Philippine Air Force aircraft as that was operating over the Scarborough Shoal. So it was conducting a routine patrol. Now, that's quite interesting because what we are seeing is, yes, technically the de-escalation pact, for as much as it applied to on-water operations, has been upheld, but not in the skies. And so this is what President Marcos has said. He's released a statement and he says, Georgina, the actions of China's aircraft were unjustified, illegal and reckless, especially as our aircraft was undertaking a routine maritime security operation in Philippine sovereign airspace. And this is the best line, I think. We have hardly started to calm the waters, and it is already worrying that there could be instability in our airspace. And one of the reasons why I wanted to draw your attention to this story today is because this is basically a cut and paste of what happened to the Australians a couple of months ago, where the Australians were conducting a routine piece of work, actually upholding sanctions against North Korea in international airspace, and the Chinese came and dropped flares in front of one of our pilots. And so this is very dangerous behaviour. It's reckless. It's designed, of course, to intimidate and keep pushing the boundaries about what China can do in terms of hostile activity that is not really what you'd call an act of outright war. But what is our response? So far, it's strongly worded statements, and I think that one from President Marcos is indeed strong. But you see there that there is no sign then of these tensions abating in what really is I think, one of the most contested regions of the world.
Tensions too here, of course, in the UK, and a lot of that fermented abroad. The Telegraph, which is a right-leaning paper, says that the riots show that the UK has lost respect for the police force. That's according to the new Home Secretary.
Yeah, this is really interesting. In the Telegraph, often, I guess, criticised or disparaged by many left-leaning voters as the Tory graph, we see an opinion piece by Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary. And she has written for the Telegraph to say that one of the symptoms of the riots, or the causes of the riots, was the very fact that people in Britain don't respect the police enough. And she says in her opinion piece, "I am not prepared to tolerate the brazen abuse and contempt which a minority have felt able to show towards our men and women in uniform." So she says this is why we've ordered this crackdown, but goes ahead to say there's a lot of rebuilding to be done in our communities after the damage of the last fortnight, but respect for the police and respect for the law and respect for each other is where we've got to start. Now, very difficult, of course, to quibble with those words, but there's a lot of complex layers in here. One is that the police have not had a great run over the last few years. And yes, I think we'd all agree with Yvette Cooper that there is a lack of trust in the police from the community. And it's not just the people who are rioting. There's a lot of people who feel like the police are selective about what laws they are enforcing. And of course, then it comes down to resourcing, that the police simply don't have enough resources and people to go out and investigate a lot of the petty crime that is eroding trust in the institutions in our community. So there's a lot going on here, and I think it's very interesting that she's making this message to the Telegraph without acknowledging any of that historical complaint or concern about the nature of policing in Britain at this time.
Interestingly enough, I don't know if you saw David Olusoga writing in The Observer yesterday, but he made the point that riots are not protests. There's a difference between motivations and excuses. He says, despite much that's been said, the riots were not born of legitimate grievances about poverty, underinvestment and the breakdown of basic services, all supposedly deepened by mass immigration. The people attacked on the streets, those who defended their places of worship, their homes, they are neighbours of the rioters. They live in the same towns. They suffer the consequences of the exact same poverty and underinvestment. This is a systemic problem within our society, in other words.
Yes, and I don't think Britain is alone. I mean, we are seeing this sort of trouble. We're seeing rises of fringe parties, third parties, independent parties, minor parties, populist parties all over the Western world, because a lot of these complaints or grievances, I think people do project the same sorts of reasons onto why that they feel that their lives are not getting ahead, why they feel that their purses are a bit lighter, why they feel like life is a bit harder just to get up and get through every day and not see as much reward. And so naturally, people's complaints turn to things like immigration and other, what they perceive to be taking away a life that they might have been able to hold on to. So there's a lot of that sentiment fueling, of course, these riots, but I think these are a symptom of something that's much more structurally deep in our societies. And of course, not everyone needs to or chooses to show their concern about what are their legitimate complaints about the way life is going for them in this nature.
Now, Olympics. So much coverage of the Olympics. But we're looking ahead not just to Los Angeles, but to Brisbane in 2032.
It seems like a lifetime away, but no doubt you and I will be talking enough that it will be around the corner in no time. Are you going to go, Georgina?
To Brisbane in 2032, yes. If I can still walk by then.
You'll have plenty of time to plan, because that's what's going on in Australia. And John Coates is a very experienced Olympian organiser. He was, back in the day, I think, organising the Sydney Olympics. And so he has been asked about plans for Brisbane as the Paris event comes to a close. And he's made this quite funny quote where he says, just trust us. I mean, who do we trust these days, right? No one trusts anyone these days. But he says, we're not going to build white elephants in Brisbane in terms of stadia that's going to be used once and then left to the scrap heap. We are going to be investing in things like transport and getting people around the city. And he makes actually a really interesting observation that there were big venues in Paris that were purposefully built for the Games, and there were lots of empty seats in those. So he has set out as a goal to ensure that that doesn't happen in Brisbane, that they will be able to get people in and out of these venues and to events well within time. And that's going to be quite critical for Australia. If that is possible, that it happens, that will be a remarkable achievement, because we just don't have transport systems in our cities the way that you might experience in London or even Paris. You know, Paris does have a great metro. It is very easy to get around Paris and cover a lot of distance quite easily. In Brisbane, it's not the same. In Sydney, it's not the same. In Melbourne, it's not the same. And not at the level of access and speed. So if they do end up investing in transport, it could be one of the few Olympics that we have where people go, gee, there was an actual lasting legacy. And I think that's always been the battle with the Olympics. It's not so much about whether this draws tourists to you, because it's a little harder to quantify. But if people can look around and see, well, I got a new train line out of that, I think they might feel quite positive about that, just as much as we do with Australia somehow managing fourth in the Olympic medal tally, a country of 26 million. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, enough boasting now. Thank you. Latika, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had launched an incursion into Russian territory to restore justice and pressure Moscow's forces in his first acknowledgement of Kyiv's surprise offensive into the western Kursk region. Zelensky said on Sunday Russia had launched nearly 2,000 cross-border strikes on Ukraine's Sumy region from the region of Kursk this summer, and that such strikes deserved a Ukrainian response. Israel expanded evacuation orders in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip overnight, forcing tens of thousands of Palestinian residents and displaced families to leave in the dark as explosions from tank shelling reverberated around them. The Israeli military said it was attacking militants from the Hamas group, which administered Gaza before the war, who were using those areas to stage attacks and fire rockets. And Hong Kong's top court today unanimously dismissed the bid to overturn the convictions of media tycoon Jimmy Lai and 6 other pro-democracy campaigners for an unauthorised assembly in 2019. Lai, who's 76, the founder of the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily, and 6 others, including veteran Democrat Martin Lee, had been found guilty of organising and participating in an unauthorised assembly in August 2019 during months-long pro-democracy protests in the China-ruled city. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Paul Kagame was sworn in yesterday for another 5 years as Rwanda's president after he claimed to have won last month's election with more than 99% of the vote. Kagame has ruled the small African nation since the 1994 genocide, first as a de facto leader and then president. He's won every presidential election he's contested, each time with more than 93% of the ballot. A number of African leaders attended the inauguration at a 45,000-seat stadium in Kigali. Well, I'm joined now by Michaela Wrong, who's a former correspondent for Reuters and the Financial Times. She's also the author of 5 books on Africa, including Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. And that's all about Rwanda. Michaela, do we know how that ceremony went off? It's a huge stadium to fill. Who was there and possibly more importantly, who wasn't?
Yes, but we do know. I watched it. You could watch it long distance. It was a 4-hour ceremony. The stadium, which has been newly unveiled, was packed to the gills. Lots of the members of the audience had been organised in the colours of the Rwandan flag. Green, blue, and yellow, and it was there was a group of, I think it was 22 African heads of state. But what was significant at this very military, I mean, it was an extremely military display, was that Rwanda's key neighbours were not, the heads of state did not turn up. So that means Uganda, Yoweri Museveni did not turn up. Burundi, Evariste Ndayishimiye did not turn up, and nor did Felix Tshisekedi, the president of neighbouring DRC. And I think that really highlights one of the key themes, which is that Rwanda is seen by many of its neighbours as being a destabilising force, as interfering in its neighbours' political affairs, and there's no love lost there between those heads of state. So I think their absence was significant.
Tell us about the Rwandan presence in the DRC.
Well, yeah, I mean, this has become increasingly a matter of international concern. Since November 2021, we've seen the M23 rebel movement, which is a rebel movement. It's of Congolese members of the Tutsi community. But everyone knows that it's supported and armed and equipped by Rwanda. And they've been gobbling up land since late 2021. And since late 2023, recently, there were statistics showing that they've got 70% more land. They have almost completely surrounded Goma, which is the capital of North Kivu province. Just recently, they broke a ceasefire and seized another border town, Ishasha. So they keep capturing more and more land. And we just saw a UN group of experts coming out with a report saying that, yes, there are M23 rebels there, they're Congolese rebels, but actually fighting alongside them, there are 4,000 Rwandan troops using increasingly sophisticated weaponry.
Now,
intervention, yes.
In Kenya, in Uganda and Nigeria, we're seeing youth-led movements challenge old guard political power. With 65% of the population under 30 in Rwanda, Kagame is the only leader most Rwandans have ever known. And I wonder if there's any indication that the youngsters there may also be fed up with their 66-year-old leader, who claims to have won the vote by 99.18%, somewhat implausibly.
Yes, I mean, basically Kagame pre-rigged these elections by ensuring that the only really credible opposition leader, Victoire Ingabire, was not allowed to run on the grounds that she had a criminal record, because, of course, he had jailed her in a previous era. So I think everyone regarded that the outcome was a done deal. Yes, there certainly is a youth bulge, and Rwanda remains, despite this glossy exterior that it presents to the world, remains a very poor country, and there's a high youth unemployment. But the problem is, I think the place is locked down so tight that you just wouldn't see what we've been seeing happening in Kenya. And there have been little sparks of protests going on in Uganda. And as you say, also in Nigeria. I mean, this is a very militarized society. And I think that was the thing that I really took away from that inauguration ceremony, was this extremely disciplined, superbly rehearsed, but sort of vaguely sinister North Korean style military display. Anyone who would think of sort of protesting on the streets would have been reminded at that inauguration of just how tightly Kagame controls the government, the country, and how strong and domineering his army is, both at home and abroad.
Michaela, thank you very much indeed. That's Michaela Wrong there. You're with Monocle Radio. It's 14:39 in Beijing, 8:39 in Zurich. The South Pacific Islands are in the middle of a tussle for dominance between China and the United States. One island nation in particular, Fiji, has been very clear that it wants support from Beijing whilst also retaining a good relationship with Western countries. Well, that balancing act may become a little more difficult for Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka, who begins a 10-day visit to China today. Well, joining me for more is Edward Kavanagh, who's a journalist reporting from the Pacific Islands and the author of Divided Isles, Solomon Islands and the China Switch. Edward, welcome to the show. Why is Fiji of so much interest to competing superpowers?
Well, yeah, look, Fiji is really the heart of the Pacific Islands economy and in many ways Pacific Islands culture. It's if we exclude Papua New Guinea, Fiji is by a long way the largest country. It's got around 1 million people. It's really the economic and regional hub of the entire Pacific Islands region. It's where the University of South Pacific is, the other regional institutions are based. So Fiji is, the beating heart of the region, and it's absolutely the gateway, I guess, to the entirety of the Pacific for all partners engaging with the region.
So in October, Rabuka was in Australia. He said he preferred dealing with democratic traditional friends when he was asked about China's security role in the South Pacific. But in March, he agreed to maintain a policing cooperation deal with China. What's that about?
Rabuka is a bit more skeptical, I would say, of the China relationship than his predecessor, Frank Bainimarama, and also some of the other regional leaders that we've seen in the past in recent years, particularly Manasseh Sogavare of Solomon Islands, who was a very high-profile pro-China leader over the past few years, and more recently Charlotte Salwai, who's the Prime Minister of Vanuatu. Rabuka is a long-standing political figure in the Pacific. He was once Prime Minister, 20 or 30 years ago. He's come back to power. He definitely favours these traditional relationships, but he certainly sees the value still in retaining an economic partnership with Beijing and certainly even leveraging anxiety from countries like Australia and the United States over Beijing to extract other concessions. And I think he's seen the success that many other Pacific countries have had in recent years, where they've flirted with a China relationship, with deepening that relationship. It's actually paid dividends in terms of the other development support they've received from other traditional partners. So he is on the record as being a little more skeptical of the China relationship for sure, but he also, I think, sees the pragmatic benefits of expanding that relationship too.
So we know that he met Xi Jinping at the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Summit in San Francisco last year. And Xi pledged to help Fiji safeguard its security and sovereignty and to cooperate on infrastructure. So this long trip to Beijing is presumably to hammer out the details. And I wonder what either side really want from each other. What does Fiji want and what does China hope to gain?
Well, for Fiji, it does need to turn to partners like China for the large-scale infrastructure investment and support. Countries like Australia, which has the largest, aid and development footprint in the region, doesn't typically do large-scale infrastructure well. As I noted, Fiji is a large country. It's a growing country. It does have deteriorating roads and it needs better airport infrastructure and the like. And when you look around the world, China is the only likely partner for many of those types of projects. So there's a clear economic relationship benefit that will come from deepening those ties from the Fijian side. And of course, as I said, Fiji is really the beating heart of the Pacific Islands. For China, which is seeking to exert itself more in the region and to entrench itself as an economic player and political player in the Pacific Islands, fostering and deepening those ties with Fiji certainly makes sense. So what we'll likely see over the 10-day visit is that very high-level ceremonial engagement in Beijing. I'm sure the red carpet will be rolled out for the Fijian Prime Minister, but there'll also be some quite specific engagements with large industry players, with regional companies and other sort of infrastructure partners you'd expect from across China that are looking to invest in Fiji.
And just finally, how do Fijians feel about the country's allegiance to one power or another?
Well, typically Pacific Islanders are very wary of being seen as a geopolitical playing field and being in the middle of this geopolitical contest. So most Pacific Islanders are very favourable towards their relations with Australia. They have good people-to-people ties with Australia, so they certainly don't want to be in a position where they have to pick and choose. And there is also a degree of scepticism and suspicion around the intentions of China in the region amongst everyday people all across the Pacific. So by and large, people don't want to pick and choose. They want to have cordial relationship with the entire world. Pacific Islanders really cherish their democracies, their sovereignty, and they don't want to be pushed around by any partner, even friendly ones like Australia.
Thank you very much, Edward. That's Edward Kavanagh there, reporting from the Pacific Islands. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time to talk about the Balkans with Monocle's correspondent for the region, Guy Delaunay. A warm welcome to you, Guy.
Many thanks, Georgina, and morning all.
Serbia's lithium protests charge up. Nice headline. Tell me the detail.
Well, indeed. I think people might have been following some of the things which have been happening in Serbia with regards to lithium mining, because it's been making international headlines, not just headlines in the region. Serbia is sitting on top of what are apparently the largest deposits of lithium in Europe. That's got the mining giant Rio Tinto extremely excited. Likewise, Serbia's government. But of course, it's agitated people who are concerned about what this might all mean for the environment. Now, there was a ban on lithium mining, which was imposed by Serbia's government in 2022. That was after large protests, which got the government rather worried that it might affect the elections. This time round, the government has said, actually, we're getting new environmental reports saying it's all okay. And the Constitutional Court has said that a ban on lithium mining is unconstitutional. So we're going to look into this again. And the response from the environmentalists has been ramping up, charging up indeed, as I've popped in my notes to you, Georgina. And over this weekend, it's really gone to a very high level with big protests in Belgrade, railway stations being blocked by environmentalists, big protests outside the government last night as well, outside the main government building. And I can only see this continuing until there's some sort of dialogue between the government and the environmentalists, although how to get them sitting around the same table is another question.
Now, over-tourism is a headline that we're seeing about a lot of places in the world. Montenegro, I wouldn't have thought would be one of them, but indeed that is an issue there.
Quite right. And this is the World Heritage Site of Kotor, which is now reporting that it's got its own over-tourism problems. And to be honest with you, Georgina, this one doesn't come as quite so much of a surprise to me, because I've been to Kotor. It's a very small, very beautiful place on the Adriatic with the mountains coming right down to the sea. And you have this spectacular bay which curves around, and this very, very beautiful ancient town as well. If you've got one cruise ship which pulls up to Kotor's port and disgorges a couple of thousand passengers, that almost instantly overwhelms the town, which has these very narrow cobbled streets, very ancient buildings, and it's not really built for an influx of modern tourism. And now they're saying they're getting 5,000 cruise ship passengers per day at the height of the season. Now, you can imagine what that's like. And I already advise people, if they're going to the Adriatic, to places like Dubrovnik, time your visits carefully. Look at the cruise ship schedule, for goodness sake, because it does overwhelm the town. And Kotor is the latest one. It's just down the coast from Dubrovnik. People might be thinking, maybe that'd be a good alternative. You might want to think again, Georgina.
And of course, it's famous because of James Bond movies.
That's right. I mean, it featured in the 2006 James Bond film Casino Royale. You might remember he's going on the train there with Eva Green, isn't he? They're going to Porto Montenegro on a beautiful train, which I'm sorry to say doesn't actually exist in real life, this beautiful train, but the beautiful scenery at Kotor and the nearby Porto Montenegro actually do. So, of course, you do get people who are interested in that. If they want to live a bit of the James Bond lifestyle, why not look at Kotor? And I thoroughly recommend it as a place to visit. Just don't go on a cruise ship.
Venice is charging people to go in. Does Kotor?
There is a levy on cruise ship passengers. It's pitifully small at the moment. It's less than €1 per passenger. for somebody to visit Kotor on a cruise ship. And of course, the passengers don't feel this directly. If you're going into Venice right now, if you turn up at Santa Lucia station in Venice as a day tripper, they'll be checking on certain days whether you've paid €5 to go in. And they'll be very unhappy if you haven't. If you're coming in as a cruise ship passenger into Kotor, it's already, the levy, tiny as it is already taken care of within the cruise ship, the price for the cruise ship that you've already paid. And, the issue that everybody has with cruise ship passengers is, of course, that they stay on board, that, they often pull into a port, they go out for the day, disgorge into these narrow streets of Kotor, of Dubrovnik, go and see the sights, and then head back to the cruise ship for dinner and accommodation. And that, of course, doesn't do that much for the local businesses, and certainly causes disgruntlement among the locals.
Guy, thank you very much indeed. I shan't be going to Kotor on your advice. That's Guy Delaunay, Monocle's Balkans correspondent there. And you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Nestled in the centre of Ukraine's capital, the Kyiv Pershek's Lavra is an ancient complex of golden domed monasteries, catacombs and museums dating back to the medieval kingdoms that once ruled Ukraine. But for decades after the country's independence in 1991, it was controlled by Moscow's Orthodox Church, leaving the site's heritage out of reach to Ukraine's authorities and cultural practitioners. Now, though, Ukrainians have largely wrestled back control. So how does the Lavra fit into their broader aim to promote their culture abroad? Monocle's Julia Lassica spoke to Ukraine's Deputy Culture Minister, Anastasia Bondar, to find out more, and began by asking her why this is a moment of change for the Lavra.
Well, I guess that we have to start with a bit bigger picture of the whole country and where we are right now, and on an understanding of what is the situation overall in the country, right? We are in the third year of a full-scale invasion, the 10th year of the war. So we understand that whatever changes any of our organizations or establishment could be going through, they were also influenced by the situation around in the country. Clearly, we are surviving not only the political and technical reorganizational changes, we also are surviving struggle for peace and for our lives and for preservation of the cultural heritage in the country, including Kyiv Pershek Lavra as well, which has served for all the religious organizations for years, and it became clear that some of those religious organizations were obviously misusing not only the overall mandate of the possibility of existing in the country, but also technically the ancient buildings, and neglecting all the possibilities to be able to use those buildings on this territory. So as of now, since the full-scale invasion started, we clearly face the missile attacks over the major cities of Ukraine, including Kyiv. They also provide the blast and the sound waves, which also affect the state of the preservation, the building structure and so on. You understand that Kyiv is situated over hills, which basically creates kind of seismic activity due to the explosions in the sky as well. When the sound goes down to the ground shakes, which provides the scratches and all this sometimes unseen destructions of the ancient buildings. So the picture is really so wide, not to talk only the particular example of representatives of the Moscow Patriarchy in here, which is a problematic issue of the overall Ukrainian understanding, not only on how they behave and what they try through their representation of religion, provide the narratives of Russian propaganda. So I guess that this wide picture has to be seen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And could you tell us also about what is so special about this place? So you were talking about how they might have been misusing these spaces, but what potential does the Lavra have? What do you want to offer to the rest of the world?
I guess that the most important for us right now is to open Ukraine and Ukrainian culture for the world in order to clearly present the picture of Ukraine as the ancient territory, as the ancient culture with thousands years of culture and history, which has roots back to 1051. So these in deep roots of already existing and very, very developed civilization, including religion, education, and culture, while Moscow and all the other regions of the Russian Federation have not yet existed.
Thank you. And can you tell me about how you're going about this? How are you opening up? We were talking potentially something about the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. What sort of routes are you going down? How do you think you can best attract people's interest to this place?
In my opinion, one of the ideas of development of our culture and also opening to the whole world is to find those links in the relations in the ancient times between the Cavian Rus period, the period when this lavra was formed and started its most famous ages, and see and follow what were the periods and where different parts of this lavra were taken. What were the reasons of why these pieces were taken? We all know the great example, as you have mentioned, Victoria and Albert keeping the part of the Golden Gates, which were taken in the period, which was in the Soviet and Communist time. It's a great opportunity for us to show links in between how the culture and the heritage is preserved, what was the story behind it, and how we can right now see these relations between our countries.
And do you feel optimistic? Do you feel like this is something that you're sort of excited about, a process you're excited about opening up the lavra to Europe and to the world and showing what, riches Ukraine has to kind of offer, visual, historical riches? I'm thinking also very specifically about the Scythian gold exhibition. So this is gold that was kept in Crimea, and then in 2014, when Crimea was invaded by Russia, it was in an Amsterdam museum. And then finally, it's made its long journey back home here to Kyiv, where it will be kept. Are you excited about these sort of potentials that Ukraine has for soft power diplomacy?
Thanks for mentioning. This is an extraordinary case which we all survived for 10 years after the occupation of Crimea in the collection. So the collections which are right now based in our museums, they all belong to the state, which means that whatever goes out for the exhibition to any other country should come back to the country. Regarding lavra and its development, I am super excited. I am sure that it has an enormous potential not only to become the place for the religious type of development, but also cultural, also educational, also for sure museum and collections. And you can see a number of amazing museums which are represented in here for the different types of Ukrainian history and culture, and as well as I really would like to see lavra as a contemporary and digital development part, because we all understand that culture is going digital now. It's not only in order to preserve, which is the most important for us right now, because we're trying to switch from the paper magazines, wherever we had the inventories, unfortunately, in the paper form, and we did not manage to switch all of them into the digital form, which actually overall in the countries, especially in the occupied territories, pushed us towards losing so many records, which we only right now can take out of archives in order to restore and actually prove in the international arena that those items belong to us, which actually were looted and right now are somewhere at the Russian territory. But also the representation of our Ukrainian culture in the digital way. These are the immersive exhibitions, those are, the VR, the 3D, and so on and so on. So something what can ease the process of not only physical relocation, but also the possibility to see something from very far away and be available all over the world.
Anastasia Bonda, Ukraine's Deputy Culture Minister, in conversation with Monocle's Julia Lassica in Kyiv. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Vincent McAviney, Carlotta Rebello and Paige Reynolds, our researchers Sana Jimani and our studio manager Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday in London and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Monocle Radio. in association with Chanel watches. The sun is the most powerful force in our solar system. The sheer magnitude of its UV light alters every single thing on Earth. Well, almost everything. The Chanel J12 ceramic watch. Guaranteed zero color change over time. Chanel watches. Official timekeeper of Monocle Radio.